Hi, my name is Mia Armstrong-López. I'm a managing editor at ASU Media Enterprise and one of the editors behind the Future Tense Fiction series, which uses fiction to explore real issues in science and technology policy. And you can read the Future Tense Fiction series on issues.org, the website for issues in science and technology. Today, here with me, I'm really excited to be joined by Harrison Cook, who is a writer and potter living in the Midwest. His work has appeared in Gay Mag, Foglifter Journal, Gargoyle Magazine, Tri-Quarterly Review, and elsewhere. His piece Atlas was recognized as a notable essay in Best American Essays 2021, and he is the author of The Shade Technician, which is May's future tense fiction story. Harrison, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
So, just to start out, I want to ask you to describe in one or two sentences to set the stage what The Shade Technician is about.
That's a good one. The shade technician follows the main character Spencer in his essential worker duties, maintaining the structures that provide shade for people during the day. The society is functionally nocturnal, and so there is this disconnect, this period of people kind of becoming more nocturnally oriented and versus daytime.
Yeah, no, I think it's I love the story, not because I love the future that it represents, but because I think it is a really useful tool to help us explore our current future, right? So we have this world that is sort of ridden by extreme heat, in which, as you're mentioning, the society has functionally turned nocturnal, and there are these shade structures, which are called umbras, right, throughout the story. And these are operated by a private company that people have to pay to use. Spencer, our protagonist, is sort of tasked with fixing these shade structures, which means that he has to work during the day. And the story sort of documents some of the people and the things that he encounters in this work. And, I think one of the reasons that I'm so drawn to the story is because I think that everyone who reads it will sort of resonate with it in some sort of way, especially like around this time of year as we're entering into the summer. Folks are thinking about weather, folks are thinking about heat. Increasingly, they're thinking about those topics throughout the entire year, but especially now. I felt it really viscerally as someone who grew up in Arizona and loves that state, but also feels like very afraid for its future and livability. So I wanted to ask you, like, what brought you to explore the theme of extreme heat through fiction, and like, what would you say your relationship is with heat?
For sure. I feel like the Shade Technician was kind of the culmination of a lot of different media happening at the same time. For instance, I went to this one concert in Iowa. That was a 3-day event, and there was zero shading structure. And I was like, you know what? They're trying to sell everything. It wouldn't surprise me if they tried to sell shade. And so,
Yeah.
like, that was kind of like the seed of that. And then I thought of like the design aspect, like, oh, is it like a big umbrella? Is it like, a floating disc over your head? Like what could feasibly what could an umbra feasibly look like, and how could it work? Additionally, there was this amazing piece in National Geographic, and of course I'm trying to, I mention it and then I don't know who the writer or the photographer, but it was talking about how in LA specifically, they're losing shade. They're cutting down trees, and that's actually having adverse effects within specific populations of metropolitan and city goers. And inversely, in racialized neighborhoods too. This idea that like shade, it can be life saving, especially because out in California, it can have like a 20-degree difference, and
Yeah.
that kind of blew my mind because I'm in Omaha, Nebraska right now, and we have tons of trees and shade, and I can't imagine like a whole city block not having that. Like there'd be something visually off if that were the
Yeah.
case. And so that kind of made me think about that world of like, oh hey, shade actually does have a very important part in our society, and without it, um, people are going to get hurt.
Yeah.
And then it made me think like, and especially it just seems every year, the weather phenomena just becomes more dangerous and more, um, how should I say, just like it's one upping. It's one upping. Like every storm one ups the last storm, and it kind of begins this weathering effect that Spencer feels in the story too. That there's such a repetitive wave of heat and exhaustion, and how it affects the body physiologically, and it culminates into a mental toll too.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think as you're talking, I think it's so true, right? Like the story sort of accelerates this idea of selling access to shade or selling access to life-saving resources like relief from heat, sunlight, humidity. But like as you're saying with the concert example, with the California example, like in many ways that already exists. It's so true. You go to certain cities like LA, like Phoenix, and you have neighborhoods that are wealthy neighborhoods where there's lots of trees and good shaded areas, and then oftentimes you have less wealthy neighborhoods who just it feels like you're in the desert in a way that is, and you're way more exposed to sort of natural circumstances in a way that isn't true in wealthier parts of the city. You think about like who has to go stand in under these tiny little bus shelters if they're lucky enough to have a bus shelter versus who can get to work in a car. Like it's so sort of visceral.
And the designer knows how to actually make a bus shelter too.
Right, exactly. That's another
Yeah.
huge, but it's just so visceral. Like who has access to relief and respite, sort of in these spaces, and how that like affects our relationships to our cities. And I think that's like one of the other big themes in the story is like how heat affects folks' relationship to their city and then to time, right? Because we have folks, the more privileged folks who are now working at night, sleeping during the day, and not engaging with the city, not going outside often. So, like, what did you want to say about how heat affects our relationship to place and time in the story?
I think that really was inspired by me almost like sheltering in place with a couple of stretches of weeks that were just brutal, like 95 plus degree weather, and I can't go outside when it's that hot. And if I do, it's only for like 5 minutes to take my dog out. And it's just this thing that I have to do because with vago syncope syndrome, you just have to know like your triggers and to take care of it. So like during that day, during those stretches of 95 plus, humidity days that are just absolutely horrible. I have to drink electrolytes like nobody's business. I have to drink water like nobody's business. And I find that like I'm shut up inside. It's very isolating. Heat has, or I should say, heat-based climate stuff has the potential to become very isolating. And so that's one part in the short story where I wanted to talk about like, yeah, you're alone, but like you're alone together
Yeah.
as a society. But then also that's kind of amplified between the relationship between Manny and Spencer, and how that they have to work a little bit harder to bring this up. And I used to work in marketing, and so I was thinking to myself like, okay, would there be a search query? Would there be SEO around how to deal with diurnal couples? And
Yeah.
so like kind of like bringing that like help article type stuff, and bringing that with that, because I think that literally you're splitting two people up.
Yeah.
You're on different schedules. You are in different sleeping arrangements, but you still share the same place. And so to me, that's kind of the moment where the short story got really real and where I was like, oh, this could totally be a book.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, well, and I wanted to talk more about sort of those relationships, right? So you mentioned the relationship between Spencer and his partner Manny. Manny's a lawyer, sort of works during night, and Spencer working during the day. I think that their relationship was really beautiful. Like I was really drawn to the relationship in the story, and the ways that they sort of, despite that temporal barrier or strain, like made it work for each other. And there's another relationship that I also found very beautiful, which also sort of represents a division in circumstance, which is the relationship between Spencer and Buddy. So Buddy is someone who is unsheltered, who Spencer sort of encounters during his work on the Umbras as a shade technician during the day. And so, Buddy is out during the day, and he's sort of relying on these shade structures for limited, albeit limited, relief from the heat. So what did you want to sort of represent or convey in the relationship between Buddy and Spencer?
For sure. I really wanted at first, like I needed as a writer, I needed that like that element that escalated the plot, that complicated the situation. So that's where Buddy kind of came in. If no one else is supposed to be here in this designated area outside of essential workers, oh, here's kind of that foil to that situation. Secondly, I really wanted there to be a humanization of kind of the Umbra in terms of like who's this intended for, because you have Buddy who is doing it by change. He's putting change into the Umbra to get the sale, but then he's the intended user, but then this whole system or this whole area is going to be revamped, and so in some ways Buddy isn't the intended user of the Umbra, but then at the same time, he's trying to survive. And so I really wanted to invoke a lot of empathy with that, and in that, even though Spencer is in, the right doing his job, it really more draws in some moral complications for him. And I feel that with a lot of these industrial products that are being designed for like climate change or climate change proof, that it can be easily misinterpreted, like who's actually going to use this item and what the intended use is for. It wouldn't surprise me. I've been in that corporate that world, and so I know how that language is. And it's very easy to talk about the customer and dehumanize this very real person that relies on this service.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's really compelling because as you're mentioning, right, like Spencer is sort of working in this part of the city where they are going to update these umbras, these shade structures, shade and heat relief structures to a new technology where I think in the new ones, like they can't even accept coins, right? It's like you have to pay with your phone or you have to pay with a credit card, right?
Yep. Hmm.
So obviously, if you're someone who doesn't have a phone, doesn't have a credit card, going to be sort of hard to do. And I think, Spencer is such a compelling character in that way because his job as a shade technician is sort of like a pay the bills job, right? Like he's really a photographer, he's really sort of a creative person, but he needs to survive in some way. And so, you can sort of feel his conflict about the job and then also about who the job is serving, right? And that sort of comes to a head when he meets Buddy and finds some sort of evidence that Buddy might be quote unquote vandalizing the shade structures to be able to continue to use them when he doesn't have money to pay the fee. But I think to sort of continue on this conversation with the relationship between Buddy and Spencer, one of the other things that you explore through that relationship is this theme that is really a theme throughout this story, which is the question of documentation, right? So what is documented, and how does that affect how stories are told, right? So that's like a very central question for Spencer because, as I mentioned, he's really a photographer by profession and passion. He carries around a camera sort of during his shifts, as his job as a shade technician, and he does sort of strike up this friendship with Buddy, takes a photo of Buddy, and Buddy says like, wow, that's the first photo, like analog photo that has ever been taken of me. Why did you choose to make like photography and this concept of documentation so central to the story's plot?
That's a really good question because, I started when I started in writing, I started as a poet. And so love of language, love of images. And, when I started getting more into narrative spaces, this idea of like thematics started to come a little bit more prevalent. And so I was messing around, me, Harrison, was messing around with cyanotypes because I was going to teach a class on it. And just the idea of exposure, I was like, oh my gosh, this has to be the medium that Spencer is fascinated with, because it's it's the symbol of his job. Like it's just like the thematics, right? Like he's out there fixing these machines and he's exposed to the elements, but then he makes his craft with the exposure. And with that kind of documentation, what I found with cyanotypes is that it's almost like ghost photography, right? Because you have to put a negative and then the emulsion, and you get the other image, right, that we see. But it's also this elevation of an image. So I think it's interesting that Spencer, our main character, would rather have memories of those versus the actual pictures. Because I think that there is an editing involved, but then also this elevation into trying to plug into the art. And I think with documentation, it it comes down to climate change and climate collapse is happening so fast around us that literally the technology that we're like, oh hey, this is going to help us, is being outpaced. And so that's another kind of fertile ground for a short story. I was like, well, what if things aren't, what if things are in that painful transition period, right? They had this amazing idea that kind of worked, kind of didn't, and then now they're revamping it, and then this is where all that work's coming from. It kind of speaks to this idea that I have of the future as a retrograded future, and where for the first time in like a long time, maybe 100 years, the prospect of the future, we're going from the Jetsons to Mad Max. The prospects of the future aren't gleaming and shining and flying cars, right? Like it's in the dirt with the crazy motor vehicles, surviving. And so, not saying that I would try to invoke Mad Max with the Shade Technician, but the idea that we're trying our best with what we have, and sometimes it's not enough.
Yeah. I think, I think that is another thing that really came through with the story, because we started this conversation, you were talking about, how in our world that we're living in right now, every time it's the most, every year it's the hottest, every year it's the most days on record over 100 degrees, like whatever you want to, we're beating our own records at this scale that is like in so many ways terrifying. And Spencer talks about, sort of in the story, of like how he had to learn all of this new language to be able to understand his new heat-ridden world, right? Like, what is wet bulb temperature, right? What would it be like to live in precedented times? Like, how can everything be unprecedented? Or is it sort of a failure of imagination? And I'm wondering, do you think, so I have sort of a two-part question here, which is a bit of a no-no, but my two questions that I'm trying to mold together here are like, one, do you think that we sort of have the tools to understand and communicate about the climate moment that we're living in right now? And like, two, do you think fiction can play a role in doing that exploration and that communication?
That's a good two-parter. I think the main thing, I think a lot of people are aware of climate change and climate collapse. They feel it, right? They're planting their gardens earlier every year. But it's the idea that like the people in power, like, it's like that idea like I can recycle as much as I can and reduce my carbon intake, but then, there's people flying jets and there's companies polluting, right? It's like that company buy-in. And so it's like we as a society, or I should say, as a community, can take action and try to reduce our part. But it's the big players out there that don't think they need to play by the rules, or they don't have the same concerns. Um, and what was the second part? Sorry.
No, it was my fault because I did the no, but
Yeah,
there's like so many directions that I want to go with you on this. As you can tell, I'm really obsessed with the story. But the second part was like, I think this story strikes me as an example of like using fiction to explore our current climate moment in a way that is really it can feel hard to wrap your head around, like as a big thing, like as a capital C climate crisis. But like fiction is a way in to sort of understand that. So how do you see the role of fiction in exploring our current climate climate moment.
Perfect. I remember before you retold the question, I was like, "Something about climate, something
Yeah.
about the short story." Um, yeah, I really think that fiction has that imaginative push to kind of have a leave a positive impact on in terms of, like, how to navigate these situations, right? I think Margaret Atwood is quoted with saying, "I didn't want the Handmaid's Tales." No, what was she said something along the lines of, like, "No sci-fi or no futuristic writer should relish in their dystopian coming to life," you know? It's more of like "Hey, here's kind of the direction we're heading down." And so I try to approach it with the same thing, but what I kind of found lacking from climate stories that had an element of climate change or climate change fiction in them was the idea of like the humanness of it. Like, right, these are like unprecedented, very like unpredictable things, but also like we're humans trying to survive this. And that's something that I really wanted to put emphasis on is that we are in this together. Our world is changing together, and it's hard. It's unbelievable sometimes, but we're in it together. And that's something that, and then, as a writer, I'm like, okay, how do we pull that apart? And then that's when the diurnal couple came in, like what happens when you have that isolation? You either go in the basement and pump out some cyanotypes, and try to do self-care, your craft, or you can kind of look in the abyss and wait till it stares back.
Well, and I think that is what stuck with me with this story is that it's a tricky one to read because it really is just this visceral image of a climate future, but also it's a really beautiful reflection on human empathy and relationships, sort of in the midst of dire external circumstances. And I totally agree with you. Like sometimes you can feel like you're, you know, recycling and you're doing your little steps, you're walking, you're taking public transportation, and then you see like the jet flying above you, and you're like, how much does this really matter? But I think this not losing hope in those things and more importantly, just like understanding how our actions upon one another, like can have an impact and it can feel so tangible. And I think that was a really beautiful illustration in the story. So Harrison, I could talk with you about the story forever, obviously, but we'll wrap it up here. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me about the story. And I hope that everyone goes to Issues in Science and Technology at www.issues.org to read the story. So Harrison, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mia. Thank you.